Not serving us. I would say the most significant myth that we are crippled by is the myth of how the Second World War ended. I think that's the one that has to be most closely examined because it raises a very complicated set of moral dilemmas on where we now stand. I mean, the nuclear issue is undergirded by the idea that for most people, the only nuclear episode they know of is the one that ended the Great War. So they think, well, it was dirty work, but somebody had to do it. Dropping the nuclear bombs on Japan, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was a necessary evil to end that war. And as it turns out, and I would really recommend that people read a book called The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb by Gar Alperovitz, who's actually the man who taught me that thing about the magic tooth. And Gar Alperovitz wrote this book that absolutely destroys permanently the idea that we can look at what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki as heroic, as correct, as moral, and most of all, it makes it impossible to think that it was the only way we could have ended that war. And it becomes clear that what really happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki is something far more grave, far more dark. It was wartime. Nobody, myself nor Gar Alperovitz, are going to do Monday morning quarterbacking on what they were thinking at a time of war. But if you look at the declassified documents that now exist, which are quoted voluminously in that book, what it shows you is that everybody around Harry S. Truman wanted Truman to find another way to end the war other than using that bomb. And that everybody was against it, all of his military advisors were against it, and they kept asking him to clarify the surrender terms, which meant the Japanese, Japanese had 29 encryption systems for their communications. We had broken all of their code systems. We knew exactly what they were communicating internally, and what we knew most of all was that they were looking to surrender, and that they were looking to surrender for months, but that they wanted one condition, and there was only one condition left, that they would not give up, and they would fight to the death if we didn't grant them that. And that was the preservation of their emperor, and that he not be put. They had just watched Hitler kill himself. They had seen the Germans begin to be brought up on charges, and the whole idea was, we do not want our emperor brought up on charges and possibly hung. Our emperor is a god. In Japanese society, the emperor is a divine figure. Imagine killing the god of a society, effectively, in front of the people of that society. Anyone who knew anything about the need for peace in the world knew it would be a bad idea to do that. So actually, that's a pretty easy thing to grant them. It's a very smart thing to grant them. Parentheses, after bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we did grant it to them anyway. Now, but along the way, they said to Truman, clarify these surrender terms. Let the Japanese know that they'll keep their emperor, and then in August, Stalin will enter the war against Japan as he's promised us. This is all 1945. And when Stalin's Russia enters the war, the fear of that, combined with the get-out-of-jail-free card that you can have your emperor, the combination of those things will make the Japanese say, it's not worth fighting this thing, we're not going to beat Stalin, he'll destroy us, and if we keep our emperor, which as the Americans are telling us, we're done. So people said to him, if you want to end the war, that's how you do it. So they headed for Potsdam in July, and Harry Truman had in his possession what had been drafted, which was the Potsdam Proclamation. And in the Potsdam Proclamation was a passage which granted the Japanese their emperor, let them know that, gave them that confidence that they could then feel comfortable when Stalin entered the war, which we knew and they didn't know was going to happen, they would fold. That was July 7th of 45 that Harry Truman traveled across the ocean on the Augusta, the USS Augusta. It took a week to get there. On July 15th, he arrives. The conference is supposed to start on July 17th, the Potsdam Conference. On July 15th, the atom bomb is successfully tested in the New Mexico desert. News of it is told to Harry Truman. He now realizes that he doesn't want the Russians to end the war, because that will empower Russia in a post-war world as having been the war enders. So he doesn't need them to end the war, because now it can be done with the bomb. Better done by us with the bomb than Stalin without a bomb. And what that now means is that they don't want the Japanese to surrender. They want the Japanese to keep on fighting, so that we need to bomb them. And so that paragraph 12 that had been put in giving them their emperor is ripped out. And we enter the July 17th, 1945 Potsdam Conference without giving their emperor, forcing them to fight to protect their deity, so that we then can bomb them on August 6 and 9 with 2 bombs, one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki. And by the way, before the impact of Hiroshima could even be felt, we tested the other bomb on Nagasaki, which has its own criminal components of having really just been a bomb test using human beings. And then a few days later, Stalin enters the war, and 3 days after that, the Japanese emperor surrenders. And by the way, in his surrender statement, he never mentioned the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He said he was leaving the war because of the Russian entry. And after that, we granted the Japanese emperor that we were not going to grant 4 weeks earlier. So once you know all that about it, you say to yourself, no, it's all not true. I've been told that if we didn't bomb Japan, if we kept on fighting, we'd lose 1 million men. 1 million American men would be lost in a ground invasion of Japan. Many people, have everybody heard that phrase? Everybody's heard that phrase. I heard that phrase. Turns out that's a completely fictional notion that was invented by a man named James Conant after the bombing. That about 6 months later, 9 months later, a year later, articles started to appear from Reinhold Niebuhr, Albert Einstein, and others saying, looks like we might have done this to scare the Soviets. Looks like this might have not been the most moral thing to do. Looks like there's a bit of a story here. And James Conant was president of Harvard at the time. And he had been the chief academic on the Manhattan Project's development committee. And he said, he wrote a letter to McGeorge Bundy's father. McGeorge Bundy would later work with John F. Kennedy. McGeorge Bundy's father, and he wrote to him, we got a problem here. This bombing is starting to become questioned in the mainstream media by some of our leading intellectuals. And they are fostering a very misleading vision of history. And it's a kind of sentimentalism that would be particularly attractive to the kind of people who become history teachers and things like that. And therefore, it's very destructive and very dangerous to what an entire young generation of Americans will think about this. And I think that what we need is an article, a premier publication that will be written by a premier American statesman that will explain the reasons why we had to do what we did and how sound a decision it was. And I think we should have Secretary of War Henry Stimson write that article. Well, wait a second, Mr. Conant. I think he's kind of opposed to the bombing. He seems a little bit uncomfortable about it himself. Oh, no matter, no matter. McGeorge, we can have your son, McGeorge, we can have your son, McGeorge Jr., we can have him write the article, and he'll ghostwrite it, and then we'll get Stimson to put his name on it. So McGeorge Bundy spent months and months and months writing an article called The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb. The same name as Mr. Alperovitz's more newer book. And they wrote this thing, and James Conant, the president of Harvard, edited copiously this draft letter that McGeorge Bundy was writing for Henry Stimson to be published in the newspapers. And basically, at the end of this process, McGeorge Bundy wrote this letter. Henry Stimson didn't pen a word of it. James Conant edited it like crazy for months and months and months. And in that article, at one point in one of the drafts, out of nowhere, James Conant added the figure, the notion, that we would have lost 1 million men in any future ground invasions of Japan. In fact, the Joint War Planning Council, which was at that time the Joint Chiefs, basically, they had done an assessment of any future losses we might have had, and it was 20 to 40,000 American men. So 20 to 40,000 didn't sound good against having killed 250,000 Japanese people in 2 days. You needed a better sounding argument for why it had been necessary, and 1 million sounded a lot better than 40,000. That was an invention of James Conant. We've been living with it to this day. It's probably the most significant American myth we live by, and the danger of it is it makes it seem like nuclear weapons were once really useful. So maybe we shouldn't get rid of them, because after all, they did that good thing in that war. Yes, sir? Time? What should I put? Wrap it up. That's all. Well, I just want to say, you know, I'm full of a lot of, I listen to myself, and I must be the most, I'm like a walking downer, you know, and the fact is, like, you know, it isn't, I mean, it's all, there's a lot of really, do you want me to call my